They threw her out onto the street when she was 7 months pregnant. It was raining, as though the sky were crying too. And then, a black car stopped. The suitcase fell first. It struck the wet pavement, sprang half open, and a tiny knitted baby cap rolled into a puddle by the curb. Julia walked slowly down the steps, one hand on her back and the other supporting her 7-month belly, while the rain plastered her hair against her face. Above her, on the third-floor balcony, Rebecca Caldwell watched with her arms crossed, dry, sheltered, satisfied. "There is no place for liars in this family," she said, in a voice that did not need to rise in order to wound, and even less for children with an unknown father. Behind the building's curtains, the neighbors pretended not to watch. A woman on the first floor turned off her light so she could see better. No one came out. No one said anything. Only the rain spoke, and rain defends no one. Julia bent down, picked up the soaked little cap, and pressed it to her chest. She did not cry in front of them. She raised a hand to her neck, found her mother's old locket, and closed her eyes for 1 second. What Rebecca did not know, what none of the people spying from behind their curtains could have imagined, was that this woman, missing one shoe, drenched and homeless, would spend that very night beneath the roof of the most feared man in the city, and that before 3 months had passed, she would own every brick in that building, every door that remained closed that night. Yellow headlights swept across the street. A long, silent black car slowed in front of the building. The rear window began to lower. But to understand that night, to understand why that car stopped and why that window came down, we have to go back 1 month, to an anniversary dinner, to a house where Julia still believed patience could buy love. If anyone has ever made you feel invisible in your own home, stay until the end. This story is told slowly, the way debts are counted, and that night, every one of them was paid. 1 month earlier, the Caldwell home smelled of fine furniture polish and white flowers. It was the wedding anniversary of Rebecca's late parents, a date she celebrated each year with more guests and less affection, because it was not about remembering anyone. It was about displaying things, displaying the porcelain dinnerware, displaying the chandeliers, displaying that the Caldwell name still meant something in the city. Julia had been on her feet since 6 in the morning. She had ironed the tablecloths, polished the silver, and cooked the roast that the longtime cook no longer prepared because the longtime cook was no longer being paid. Julia knew that detail better than anyone, though no one thanked her for it. At 8 that evening, when the guests arrived, she was still wearing her apron. "Take that off," Rebecca ordered in the hallway, looking her up and down. "Though, on second thought, leave it on. At least then your role in this house will be clear." "Rebecca, I am nearly 7 months pregnant," Julia answered quietly, without losing her composure. "I am only asking you to let me sit down for a moment during dinner." "Sit down?" Rebecca smiled, and her smile was worse than any insult. "My daughter-in-law serving the table is intimate, a family matter. My daughter-in-law sitting there, panting with that belly in front of my guests. That, dear, is a spectacle. And in this house, we do not put on spectacles." Glasses were already clinking in the dining room. Brandon, her husband, was laughing with his mother's business associates in a new jacket Julia did not know when he had bought or with what money. Not once did he look up to find her. Not once did he ask why his pregnant wife was carrying trays in and out of the kitchen, while everyone else raised their glasses. Julia poured the wine, bending carefully and protecting her belly from the edge of the table. One of the guests, the wife of a business associate, looked at her with poorly concealed pity and whispered thank you. She was the only one. Rebecca raised her glass. "To this family," she said, "to those who carry the name with dignity. This house has standards, and those standards are defended every day." The guests applauded. Standing beside the kitchen door with the empty tray in her hands, Julia felt that the words were not directed at the dead people they were supposedly honoring that night. They were directed at her. They were always directed at her. She took refuge in the kitchen for a moment, set down the tray, and breathed. Her lower back ached with a dull, constant pain. The baby kicked as though protesting for both of them. Julia lowered her eyes, smiled faintly, and touched her neck. The familiar locket was there, gold and worn, with 2 nearly erased letters engraved on the back, an A and a W. "It belonged to my mother," she had once explained to Brandon, back when he still asked questions. It is the only thing she left me. Brandon had looked at it for 2 seconds and said it seemed old, that someday they should sell it. Julia never showed it to him again. She wore it inside her blouse, against her skin, the way people carry things no one else would understand. That night, as she washed the glasses from someone else's anniversary, she could not have known that the worn locket was worth more than all Rebecca's silver. Not because of the gold, because of the last name it concealed. She returned to the dining room with dessert, and that was when she saw him. Brandon stood in a corner of the room with his back to the guests, typing on his phone with a half-smile Julia had not seen since they were dating. He typed, erased, and typed again. When she approached with the plates, he locked the screen so quickly that the phone nearly slipped from his hand. "Everything all right?" Julia asked. "Work," he answered without looking at her, slipping the phone into the inside pocket of his jacket, over his heart. Julia served dessert in silence. She had learned not to ask twice. But as she walked back toward the kitchen, she heard behind her the short vibration of a new message, and Brandon's low laugh, that private laugh that no longer belonged to her. What Julia did not know was that the message had a first and last name, and that very soon, the woman who bore that name would sit at Julia's own table, use her own cup, and try on the entire life being taken from her piece by piece. Dinner ended after midnight. The guests left the room filled with half-empty glasses, and Rebecca retired to her bedroom without saying goodnight, like a queen who owed no courtesies to her servants. Julia cleared everything away, alone. When she finally went upstairs, her ankles swollen and her back tied in knots, she found Brandon in bed with his phone in his hand, the screen lighting his face. "Brandon?" she said softly, sitting on the edge of the bed. "I need to talk to you. Your mother treated me like an employee all night. I am 7 months pregnant. I cannot keep doing this." He did not take his eyes off the screen. "You are exaggerating. Mom is like that with everyone." "She is not like that with everyone. She is like that with me." Brandon sighed, the long, tired sigh of men who consider listening a favor in itself. He locked the phone, placed it face down on the nightstand, and turned off the light. "I have an important day at the store tomorrow," he said in the dark. "New people are coming. Try not to make my life harder, Julia. Just this once." She remained seated on the edge of the bed in the darkness, one hand resting on her belly. The baby moved slowly, as though settling into place. New people. Julia did not ask who. She had already learned that answers arrived on their own in that house, and they always arrived like a blow. The store was called Caldwell House, and it occupied the most elegant corner of a downtown shopping arcade. Fine furniture, crystal lamps, armchairs that cost what a laborer earned in a year. On the outside, everything gleamed. On the inside, as Julia knew better than anyone, the numbers were bleeding. Because there was something neither the customers nor the employees imagined. The real accounts of Caldwell House were not kept by the accountant in a suit and tie, whom Rebecca showed off at meetings. Julia kept them at night, at the kitchen table, in a worn-covered notebook. It had begun 3 years earlier, when she accidentally discovered an error on an invoice that nearly led to a seizure of their assets. From then on, Rebecca tossed papers onto the table as though feeding an animal. "Check this," she would say. "Those little numbers of yours ought to be good for something." And Julia checked. She found the mistakes, balanced the payments, stretched money that was not enough. Because of that notebook, the store remained open. But at the Caldwell table, credit was like wine. It was served only to those who bore the family name. That morning, Julia arrived at the store, carrying a box of fabrics for the upholsterer. Rebecca had ordered her to bring it by phone, without asking how she felt, and without remembering that the doctor had forbidden her to carry weight. At the entrance to the arcade, the security guard helped her with the box, and Julia thanked him with that smile of hers that nothing seemed able to wear away. Inside, the air smelled of expensive perfume, and in the middle of the main showroom, beside a green velvet sofa, stood the woman. Tall, with black hair styled as though for a magazine and a cream-colored coat that seemed to float over her shoulders. She was laughing at something Brandon said, and Brandon laughed with her, leaning toward her, attentive, radiant. Julia had not seen him like that in years. "Julia," Rebecca said, appearing among the furniture with a hostess's smile. "How timely. Come say hello. This is Paige Rivers. Her family is interested in becoming our business partner. Paige, this is Brandon's wife." There was a pause before the word wife. A small, measured, poisonous pause. Paige turned and looked her over from head to toe, stopping at Julia's gray wool coat, the coat she had worn through 3 winters, its cuffs already shiny from use. "Oh, how sweet," Paige said, pressing one hand to her chest. "That coat is vintage, isn't it? Reviving old clothes is very fashionable now, though, of course, you have to know how to wear them. The humble look does not suit everyone." 2 saleswomen exchanged a glance. One lowered her head to hide a smile. The other, the younger one, pressed her lips together in discomfort. Brandon said nothing. He looked at his watch as though the scene were unfolding in a language he did not speak. "It is a warm coat," Julia replied calmly, holding her gaze. "In my condition, that is all I ask of my clothes." Of course, in your condition." Paige smiled, and her eyes dropped to Julia's belly, the way someone looks at a badly placed piece of furniture. "Rebecca, dear, shall we continue? You were showing me the chairs for my apartment's living room. Brandon says I have exquisite taste." "She does," Brandon confirmed. And the 3 of them walked away among the furniture, leaving Julia standing beside the box of fabrics in the middle of the store she kept alive from her kitchen table. The younger saleswoman came over and quietly offered her a glass of water. Julia accepted it. Her hands trembled a little, but she did not lower her eyes. That evening, when she returned to the building, rain was beginning to gather in the sky. Frank Dawson, the doorman, opened the elevator door for her and held it with his foot, as he always did. "Mrs. Julia, you look tired." It was not a question. Frank was 60 years old and had a way of looking at people that required no explanation. "Wait, do not go upstairs yet." He disappeared into his small doorman's booth and returned with a steaming cup of tea. "Chamomile," he said. "My wife says it is the best thing for the baby. May God watch over both of you." Julia wrapped her cold hands around the cup and felt her eyes fill with something that was not sadness. It was something else. It was the astonishment that the only tenderness in her day had come from the lobby, not the 3rd floor. "Frank, you are far too kind to me." "You were kind first, ma'am. I do not forget." The doorman lowered his voice and glanced toward the stairs as though sharing a secret. "And I will tell you something. This building knows who is who. Even the owner knows, though no one knows him." "The owner?" Julia blew across the tea. "Doesn't the apartment belong to Mrs. Rebecca?" Frank gave a short, nearly soundless laugh. "To Mrs. Rebecca? No, Mrs. Julia. Everyone here is a tenant, even the people who walk around like owners. The whole building, and the arcade where the store is located, belong to the same man, an older gentleman. No one ever sees him. But I will tell you something curious. In 20 years, he has never raised the rent on the long-time tenants. They say it is because of a promise. No one knows to whom he made it." Julia smiled, thinking it was one of those legends old buildings collect. She drank her tea, thanked him, and went upstairs. She could not imagine that the promise bore a woman's name, or that it was the same name engraved in 2 worn letters on the locket resting against her chest. The apartment was silent when she entered. Brandon had not come home. Julia warmed dinner, waited half an hour, and finally ate alone, with the radio playing softly so she would not hear the echo of her own spoon against the plate. Before going to bed, she opened the closet to put away the coat that now had a new last name, Humble. As she pushed the boxes on the upper shelf aside, her fingers brushed against a tin box at the back, behind the winter sheets. She brought it down carefully. It was an old cookie tin with rusted edges and a faded ribbon that had once been blue. Inside, she knew without opening it, were the letters. A bundle of sealed envelopes tied with that ribbon, which her mother had placed in her hands during her final week in the hospital, when she barely had a voice left. "Promise me one thing, Julia," she had said, her cold fingers gripping Julia's. "Do not open them now. Open them on the day you cannot take any more, the day you have nothing left. That day, these letters will return to you what I did not know how to give you." Julia had been 19 then. She had made the promise through tears without understanding it. Her mother, Audrey, had been a woman of long silences who sewed for other people and never, not once, spoke about her own family. When Julia was a child and asked about her grandparents, Audrey would look down at her hands and say, "There are doors I closed to protect you," and nothing more was said. 8 years had passed. The box had survived 3 moves, the marriage, and her arrival in this house, where everything that belonged to her seemed to be in the way. Julia stroked the lid with her open palm. "Not yet, Mom," she murmured. "I can still endure it." She returned it to the back of the shelf behind the sheets. Had she known what was inside, the entire Caldwell family's life would have collapsed that very night. But promises made to the dying are the only promises poor people keep in full, and Julia was poor in everything except her word. The following Thursday was her 30-week prenatal appointment. Dr. Reynolds had underlined it on her card. Important ultrasound. Do not miss it. Julia had been looking forward to the appointment for days, the way one looks forward to a celebration, because for a few minutes before the gray ultrasound screen, she was not the daughter-in-law, the servant, or the invisible wife. She was only the mother. Brandon had promised to go with her. He had promised twice, the second time without looking up from his phone, but he had promised. At 9 on Thursday morning, Julia waited by the door, already dressed, her prenatal card in her purse. Brandon came out of the bathroom knotting his tie and smelling of the new cologne she had not bought him. "Change of plans," he said without preamble. "I cannot take you." "Brandon, it is the 30-week ultrasound," the doctor said. The doctor. He adjusted the knot in the entryway mirror. "Paige needs me to go with her, to choose marble for her apartment. Her family is about to sign with us, Julia. Do you understand what that name means? Rivers. They own half the country. I am not sending her with some ordinary salesman, as though she were an ordinary customer. But you are sending your daughter alone," Julia said, perfectly still, as though she were an ordinary daughter. Brandon stopped for 1 second. Through the narrow opening of that second passed something that might have been shame. Then Rebecca came down the hallway in a silk robe with a cup of coffee in her hand, and the opening closed forever. "You are still here?" she said to her son. "She is waiting downstairs." "That girl does not wait, Brandon. Women of her class do not know how to wait." Then, turning toward Julia with the cup near her lips, she added, "And you, stop the drama. Women have been giving birth forever, without so many doctors and so many pictures. If a cab seems too expensive, walk. Exercise is good for pregnant women." Brandon picked up the car keys and left. He did not say goodbye. The scent of the new cologne hung in the entryway for a full minute, like a taunt. Julia went alone. She took 2 buses, waited 40 minutes in a crowded room, and when Dr. Reynolds finally slid the transducer across her belly, the screen filled with the pulsing gray snow that was her child. Because it was a girl, the doctor confirmed it with a smile. A healthy, strong little girl. "Look, there is her hand. Did you come alone, Mom?" "The father is working," Julia said. The doctor looked at her for a moment over her glasses with the expression of a woman who had heard that sentence too many times, and she asked nothing more. She handed Julia the ultrasound pictures in a small white envelope. On the bus home, Julia looked at them one by one, tracing the tiny profile of the nose with her finger. She spoke silently, barely moving her lips, the way mothers speak to children who are still secrets. "You will not grow up asking permission to exist. I swear that to you." That night, a smell woke her. Smoke. Thin and sweet. The smell of burning paper. Julia sat up in bed. Brandon was sleeping deeply with his back to her. The clock read 2:15. She rose slowly, stepped into the dark hallway, and saw a line of orange light flickering beneath the kitchen door. She approached without making a sound. Through the half-open door, she saw Rebecca in her robe, standing in front of the sink. A folder lay open on the counter, and she was burning papers one by one, holding them with tongs over a candle flame and letting the ashes fall into a pot. Lit from below, her face looked nothing like the queen of the dining room. It held fear. An old, carefully managed fear, the kind hidden more skillfully than money. On the paper burning at that moment, Julia managed to make out a two-color letterhead and one word in large letters before the flame consumed it. Past due. She backed away through the darkness one step at a time and returned to bed with her heart pounding in her ears. She knew the store's numbers better than anyone, and nowhere in her notebook was there any debt bearing that letterhead. What Julia had just discovered was only the shoreline. What Rebecca burned that night was not paper. It was proof that the Caldwell name had been suspended over emptiness for years, and when a family name is suspended over emptiness, it always looks for someone else to fall in its place. The following Monday, Rebecca called her to the store. Not to sell anything to anyone, to prepare payroll. It was the end of the month, and for a year that task had fallen to Julia because Rebecca had discovered that employees were paid without mistakes when Julia prepared the envelopes. Julia counted the bills in the back room on the old desk, and when she finished, her own envelope remained on the table. Thin, her name written across it in Rebecca's sharp handwriting. Because yes, Julia was paid. A small, almost symbolic salary Rebecca called your little allowance. And it was the only thing in the world Julia could call her own. From it came her secret savings, bill by bill, kept in an envelope inside her sewing box. The fund for the crib, the diapers, and the little girl who was coming. Rebecca entered the back room without knocking, a silk scarf around her neck, and one of the saleswomen behind her. "Before you put that away," she said, indicating Julia's envelope with her chin. "We have unfinished business. The vase in the entryway."
"What vase?"
"The porcelain one. It was cracked Friday morning." Rebecca crossed her arms. "And on Friday, you cleaned the entryway." "I did not touch that vase, Rebecca. You know that. It has been cracked since before I joined this family. The crack faces the wall, which is why no one sees it." "How convenient." Rebecca's smile sharpened. "A hidden crack, hidden guilt. Things break in this house, and no one is ever responsible. Well, this time, someone will be." She took Julia's envelope from the table, opened it, counted out half the bills with 2 fingers as though afraid of dirtying herself, and slipped them into her jacket pocket. "Porcelain is expensive. Consider it a lesson in being careful." The younger saleswoman, the one who had offered the glass of water, lowered her eyes, her face red with second-hand shame. The other pretended to arrange invoices. Julia stared at the mutilated envelope on the table. She thought of the crib, she thought of arguing, and with cold clarity, she understood that Rebecca was not charging her for a vase. She was teaching her, in front of witnesses, who decided what Julia was worth. "Do you know what is curious, Rebecca?" she finally said, calmly putting away the envelope. "You bought that vase at a discount because of that exact crack. It is in the notebook. March, 4 years ago. The invoice is pasted beside the entry." The silence lasted 3 seconds. The younger saleswoman raised her eyes slightly. Rebecca went half a shade pale, and her voice came out louder than she intended. "Those little numbers of yours are not the word of God. And watch that tone. I am the one doing favors here by keeping you around." She marched out, her heels striking the floor. Julia breathed slowly. She had lost half her salary, but for the first time in a long while, she had seen Rebecca lose her footing. It was a tiny, secret victory, one of those victories that change nothing and sustain everything. 2 days later, the paper arrived. Brandon brought it to the dinner table with a pen and slid it across the tablecloth toward her, with the rehearsed naturalness of someone passing the salt. Rebecca sat at the head of the table, serving soup as though nothing were happening. "It is a formality," Brandon said. "Business matters with the Rivers family. The lawyers want the family assets organized before the partnership. Sign at the bottom." Julia picked up the document. 3 pages, tightly printed. She began reading from the title. "What are you doing?" Brandon asked. "Reading what I am being asked to sign." "It is a standard form, Julia. For God's sake." Brandon glanced at his mother. "Everyone in the family signed it. Then it should not bother you if I read it." And she did, slowly, clause by clause, while the soup cooled and Rebecca's spoon struck the bowl with growing impatience. The 3rd clause was there, crouched among the legal language. The signer relinquished all present and future rights to ownership interests in Caldwell House, including the inheritance rights of her descendants. Her descendants. Julia placed her finger on the line. This says my daughter gives up everything. A child who has not been born is surrendering what would belong to her as her father's daughter. It is lawyer language, Brandon said, avoiding her eyes. No one is taking anything from anyone. Perfect. Then we cross out this clause, initial the margin, and I will sign the rest right now. She took the pen and drew a calm, straight line through the third clause. Rebecca dropped her spoon. Who do you think you are? That document was drafted by a firm that charges more per hour than you are worth in a month. Then they can charge for 1 more hour, Julia replied, adding her initials in the margin, and drafted again without taking anything from my daughter. She pushed the paper back toward Brandon. No one spoke. Rebecca watched her for a long time, and there was more than contempt in that stare now. There was calculation. Julia held it without blinking, though her heart pounded inside her. She had just discovered that the enemy no longer wanted her obedient. The enemy wanted her gone. Gone from the table, the name, the inheritance. Only the method remained unknown. That night, she went downstairs to return Frank's chamomile cup, washed and holding 2 tangerines. She found him polishing the brass in the lobby, even though it was 10 o'clock. Do you ever rest, Frank? The owner may come tomorrow, Mrs. Julia. The doorman lowered his voice with half a smile. It is the building's worst-kept secret, and the one no one believes. One night each month, the owner walks through the building, without warning. He says hello like any ordinary neighbor, an older gentleman in a hat. He checks that the stairway light works and that the lobby is clean. Once he asked me whether the tenants were happy. Imagine that question. Happy. Owners ask whether people pay. This man asks whether they are happy. And what did you tell him? That happiness in a building shows in the flower pots. Where flowers are cared for, there are people who want to stay. Frank laughed softly. He looked at the flower pots in the lobby, looked at me, and from that month on, my paycheck came with a raise. I never learned his name. The receipts here are signed by a management company, and the management company signs for a group, and the group has a name that means nothing. But I will tell you this, that gentleman carries grief. Men who ask about other people's happiness do it because they have a locked room inside their own. Julia went upstairs thinking about that. A locked room. She had one too. A tin box behind the winter sheets. She could not know that the owner's locked room and hers were the same room, or that the door was 3 floors away, waiting 28 years for someone to turn the key. Meanwhile, in the 3rd floor dining room, Rebecca spoke quietly on the phone with her son, who had left after dinner without saying where he was going. The signature does not matter anymore, she said, watching the hallway. There are faster ways. The Rivers family is coming to dinner Friday. And that night, Brandon. That night, this house will be clean. Friday dawned beneath a burdened sky, the heavy gray that promises rain without deciding to release it. Rebecca set the entire house in motion early. She ordered white flowers, brought out the anniversary dinnerware, and hired a cook and a waiter for one night, because this dinner was not a dinner. It was a display window. The Rivers family is accustomed to the best, she kept repeating as she moved chandeliers from place to place. Nothing can go wrong tonight. She assigned Julia her role without looking at her as she passed carrying a tablecloth. You had better not appear at all. Eat early in the kitchen and lock yourself in your room. This is a business dinner, not a family gathering. Julia did not argue. By then, a night away from that table felt less like punishment than a gift. She spent the afternoon in her room, arranging the tiny clothes she had purchased with the savings in her sewing box, and she folded the same yellow sleeper for the 3rd time, simply for the pleasure of touching it. The Rivers family arrived at 8:30. From her room, Julia heard the voices rise through the house. The father's baritone laugh. Arthur Rivers, a man who spoke as though everyone owed him money. The mother's thin, bored voice, and Paige's voice, displayed that evening in its sweetest register. The cork from the first bottle, the silverware, the thick murmur of business. They had nearly reached dessert, when Julia's bedroom door opened without a knock. Rebecca stood there, wearing her display window smile, her eyes hard. "Come for a moment. The guests want to meet you." "You said—" "I know what I said. Come. Do not make me repeat myself." Julia smoothed her dress, the only decent one that still fastened over her belly, and walked down the hallway with her pulse in her throat, because Rebecca's changes of plan were never hospitality. They were ambushes. The dining room glittered. Arthur Rivers presided over the table with a glass of cognac. His wife examined the dinnerware, discreetly turning her plate as though appraising it. Paige sat beside Brandon in the seat that had belonged to Julia since her wedding, one hand resting on the tablecloth 2 inches from his. The hired waiter stopped with his tray suspended in the air. The cook peered through the swinging door. Every eye turned toward the pregnant woman in the simple dress, standing beneath the doorway. "Here she is," Rebecca announced in the tone of someone presenting unfinished business. "Julia. So you are the famous Julia," Arthur Rivers said, leaning back in his chair and looking at her with a frankness that did not bother to be polite. "We have heard about your situation." "Good evening," Julia said. "My situation is called pregnancy. 7 months. It is quite common." Someone suppressed a laugh, perhaps the waiter. Arthur raised one eyebrow, somewhere between offended and amused. Paige entered then, with the softness of a heated knife. "That is exactly what we were discussing, dear. How delicate all of this is for the partnership we are about to sign. Estates, heirs." She turned her glass in her hand. "Daddy always says a business is only as clean as the family behind it." "Exactly," Arthur said. "And I like things clear. You sign with families, not complications." "Is the child you are carrying Brandon's?" The question fell onto the table like a shattered plate. Julia felt heat rise along her neck. She looked at Brandon. And Brandon, her husband, the father of the daughter inside her, did the most cowardly thing Julia had ever seen him do. He lowered his eyes to his glass, allowed 3 endless seconds to pass, and said in a low but perfectly audible voice, "That is exactly what this family has been wondering for some time." The silence was complete. Even the cook stood motionless in the swinging doorway. Julia felt the dining room tilt, the white flowers, chandeliers, and faces, all sliding to one side. She held on to the back of a chair. "What did you say, Brandon?" "You heard me." Now that the sentence had been spoken, Brandon lifted his face, emboldened by his mother's approving look. "You work late with your numbers. You lock yourself away. You keep secrets. That box you hide in the closet. My mother is right. I do not know who you are anymore, and I will not sign business partnerships or recognize any heir until a laboratory tells me that child carries my blood. I want a DNA test. I am saying it in front of everyone so there can be no misunderstanding." "Very reasonable," Arthur Rivers approved, and drank. "Sensible," Paige's mother murmured, without releasing the plate. Rebecca folded her hands on the tablecloth, savoring the exact degree of doneness of her ambush. Paige rested her fingertips lightly on Brandon's forearm, a minimal, public gesture of ownership. Julia looked at them all, one by one, very slowly, and when she spoke, her voice was so composed that it was more frightening than a scream. "For 4 years I have slept in this house, cooked in this house, and kept this house standing with my little numbers. And you know that, Brandon. You know exactly whose daughter this is, because you know exactly what kind of woman I am." She drew a breath. The baby kicked, as though signing her name. "You will have your test, not because you deserve it, but because my daughter will not grow up with your doubt hanging around her neck. But listen carefully to what I am telling you tonight, in front of your business partners and your mother. Some questions cannot be taken back once they are asked. You have just asked one, and the laboratory result will haunt you more than it will ever haunt me." She turned toward the Rivers family with icy calm. "Good evening. I wish you a partnership as clean as this dinner." And she left the dining room with her back straight, one step after another, while behind her, no one, not even the waiter, dared move a glass. In the hallway, once there were no witnesses, she leaned against the wall and pressed a hand over her mouth to keep the sob from escaping. Inside the dining room, Arthur Rivers's voice broke the silence with a laugh of relief, and business resumed its murmur like water closing over a stone. What none of those raising their glasses that night knew was that the test Brandon had just demanded in order to humiliate his wife would arrive months later in a sealed envelope. And from that same envelope would come not one answer, but two. None of the family names seated at that table would survive the second intact. News of the dinner seeped through the house like water through a cracked wall. First came the looks from the hired cook, who, before leaving that night, silently placed a plate covered by another plate on the kitchen table for Julia. Then came the neighborhood, because the secrets of the rich are always carried in the pockets of those who serve them. And by the following Tuesday at the bakery, the cashier stopped making conversation with Julia, and two women from the building across the street lowered their voices as she passed, with the kind of silence worse than any word. "They say the baby is not his," she heard behind her. The husband himself said it in front of people. Imagine that. Julia kept walking with her chin raised and her heart dragging its feet. The lie had gone out into the street wearing new shoes, while the truth, as always, had stayed home washing dishes. That was the week Emily returned. Emily Caldwell, Rebecca's younger daughter, was 24 and had spent several months living at a friend's house, coming and going for reasons no one explained. She differed from her mother in her gestures, and resembled her far too much in her fear. A young woman who laughed loudly when Rebecca laughed, fell silent when Rebecca frowned, and had decided years earlier that the cheapest way to survive in that family was to applaud from the sidelines. She arrived on a Thursday afternoon with 2 suitcases and the drama of a fight with her friend, and by Saturday she had settled back into the role of her life, companion to Paige Rivers, who now came and went from the house with her own key to Rebecca's confidence. That Saturday, Julia found the 3 of them in the living room. The box where she kept the baby's things had been emptied across the good sofa, the one reserved for guests. Her box, the one from the closet in her room. The yellow sleeper hung from 2 of Paige's fingers as she held it aloft, the way someone holds something that belongs to another person and seems slightly dirty. "Is this clothing or a dish rag?" Paige was saying. "Feel that fabric. Poor child, she will make her entrance into life dressed from the clearance rack." Emily gave the required laugh. Rebecca smiled from the armchair, the sewing basket open at her feet. "What are you doing with my daughter's things?" Julia's voice split the scene in 2. "Oh, you appeared." Rebecca did not flinch. "We were organizing. We will need this room, and your little things take up space. Besides, Paige was kind enough to offer to decide what is useful and what is not. She actually has an eye for quality. None of this is your concern." Julia crossed the room and began gathering the baby clothes, folding them against her chest, the sleeper, the caps, the little booties purchased bill by bill. "My work paid for these." "Work?" Paige murmured with a little smile toward Emily. "Oh, right. They call the little numbers work around here." And then Julia saw it. Draped carelessly over the back of the sofa beside Paige's handbag was her mother's shawl. The fine wine-colored wool garment, with initials embroidered in thread only slightly darker at one corner. A. P. Audrey Parker. The only piece of her mother's clothing that had survived everything. The one Julia kept wrapped in tissue paper at the bottom of the box. The one she planned to use to wrap her daughter on the day she was born, so that her dead grandmother could hold her at least once. What is that doing there? This. Paige lifted it, swept it around her shoulders with an actress's turn, and spun before the living room mirror. Rebecca gave it to me. Does it not have the most divine vintage air? It is the only thing in the entire box worth saving. Old things become elegant on the right body. That shawl belonged to my mother. Julia's voice trembled for the first time. "Rebecca, you know that. I told you myself. Give it back." "I do not see anyone's name written on it," Rebecca said, threading a needle without looking up. "In this house, whatever is in this house belongs to this house, and this house decides whom it dresses." Her initials are embroidered on it, A.P. "Maybe it means antique piece," Paige said, and Emily laughed again, though this time the laugh came out shorter, because Emily's eyes remained 1 second too long on the embroidered corner, on those two small letters, and something in her young face hesitated before returning to guard duty. Julia took one step toward Paige. She never knew what she would have done, because the baby chose that moment to kick so hard that Julia had to hold her belly with both hands, and the pain bent her breath. She stood still, breathing, while the entire room watched, and she understood once again that she could not fight on their ground. Every scream she gave them would become a trophy for Rebecca. "Keep it," she finally said, very slowly, looking Paige in the eyes. "Clothes know who they belong to. That wool was woven by a woman who worked her entire life. It will itch across your shoulders every time you wear it. Not today, but one day, in front of many people, that shawl will return to my family, and you yourself will want to give it back." "Are you threatening me?" Paige raised her eyebrows, amused. "No, I am telling you the ending." She picked up the box of baby clothes and left the living room. Behind her remained a brief, uncomfortable silence, which Rebecca broke with a pair of scissors, and Paige with a comment about curtains. Only Emily stayed quiet a little longer, staring at the door through which her sister-in-law had left, the echo of the two embroidered letters, AP, circling in her mind without her knowing why. That afternoon, Julia went down to the lobby. She needed air that did not belong to that house. She found Frank watering the flower pots, and beside him, seated in the doorman's chair with a blanket over her legs, was a small woman with gentle eyes and a scarf around her head. "Mrs. Julia, let me introduce my Eleanor," Frank said, and pride changed his voice. "She felt strong enough today to keep me company for a while." "So, you are Julia." Eleanor took her hand in both of hers, warm and thin. "I have mentioned you in my prayers for 2 winters. Did you know that?" "Me?" Julia sat beside her, bewildered. "The winter I had pneumonia, when the pharmacy would no longer give us credit and this stubborn old man refused to tell anyone his troubles." Eleanor looked tenderly at her husband. "Someone left an envelope in the doorman's booth. No name. Inside was exactly what the treatment cost, along with a handwritten note, for the flowers in the lobby, so they do not wither." It took Frank months to confess whom he suspected. "You had just paid for some expense of your own and were counting coins, ma'am. And even so," Julia lowered her eyes, blushing. "Anyone would have." "No," Frank said seriously, setting down the watering can. "Not anyone. People live in this building whose cars are worth apartments, and the envelope was left by the young woman from the 3rd floor who came home from the market carrying her own bags. I do not forget that. I write it down." He touched one finger to his temple. "I keep my own notebook here, Mrs. Julia, and in my notebook you have the longest page." Julia stayed with them until evening fell, talking about nothing, the baby, the flowers, and for 1 hour life weighed less. She did not know that this exact page in Frank's notebook would one day be read aloud at Rebecca Caldwell's worst moment and at Julia's best. She was already riding the elevator upward when she saw through the lobby glass that a white van had stopped in front of the building. A man climbed out, carrying a toolbox and a drill, checked a sheet of paper, looked at the facade, and rang the 3rd floor bell. Rebecca's voice answered the intercom immediately, kinder than ever. "Come up, sir. We have been expecting you." "It is for a change of locks." The locksmith spent an hour in the apartment. Julia heard him drilling from her room, and when she stepped into the hallway after dark, she found the new keys hanging on the board by the entrance. 3 bright, freshly cut sets. She counted without touching them. 3. Rebecca, Brandon, Emily. "The locks were getting old," Rebecca said behind her in a voice so soft it felt cold. "I will give you your set later, when we clarify matters in this family." Julia did not answer. That night she placed a chair against her bedroom door, not because it would accomplish anything, but because there are nights when the body demands a trench, even one made of wood. She slept with the tin box taken down from the shelf and placed inside the closet behind her clothes. For the first time since her mother's death, she wanted it close. On Monday at the store, the air smelled of panic, dressed well. 3 weeks remained before the partnership with the Rivers family was to be signed, and Rebecca had summoned the accountant in a suit and tie to prepare the financial statements Arthur's firm demanded to review. Julia learned this when she was called in late that morning, and when she entered the back room, she found the accountant sweating over a mountain of folders while Rebecca paced like a caged animal. "The numbers do not balance," the accountant said, loosening his tie. "Ma'am, with all due respect, there are payments for which I have no record, deposits that do not match the invoices. I cannot present anything like this. It looks as though two separate sets of books have been kept. Confine yourself to organizing what I give you," Rebecca cut in. Then she saw Julia in the doorway. "Julia, come in. Bring your little numbers." She said it that way, in front of the accountant, with her usual contempt packed into the phrase "little numbers." But Julia, who knew her the way one knows one's own scar, heard what lay underneath. Need. Rebecca needed her. The entire store, the partnership, the family name, all hung that week from the worn-covered notebook. Julia took it from her bag and opened it on the table. The accountant leaned over skeptically, and 10 minutes later he no longer lifted his head. Page after page, in small, even handwriting, everything was there. Every supplier, every deadline, every payment, divided into invisible installments. Every month stretched like a sheet too short for the bed. 3 years of Caldwell House's true breathing. This. The accountant removed his glasses. "Mrs. Rebecca, this is precision work. Who taught you accounting, miss?" "Necessity," Julia said. "Well, necessity teaches better than a university. With this, I can prepare the statements. Although," he put his glasses back on, flipped to earlier pages, and frowned. "There are periods when the notebook records cash leaving with no destination. Here, and here. Large withdrawals. What are these?" Rebecca's silence lasted one instant too long. Julia knew those gaps too. They were the withdrawals Rebecca herself made without explanation. The ones recorded in the notebook with a simple R in the margin, because asking twice in that house was expensive. "Personal transactions," Rebecca finally said, chin raised. "The owners." "As far as I know, I still do not need permission to touch what is mine." The accountant did not press. Accountants in suits and ties know when a number is a number, and when it is a door better left closed. He gathered the folders and asked to borrow the notebook until Thursday. Julia said no. She would copy it and provide whatever he needed, but the notebook would not leave her hands. Rebecca was about to object. To everyone's surprise, the accountant supported Julia. "The young lady is right. An original record like this is not lent out. It is her protection." And looking at Julia with new seriousness, he added, "Keep it safe. Documents like that become more valuable the worse things get." Rebecca did not thank her. When the accountant left, she picked up her purse and said without looking at Julia, "Copy what he asked for. And do not get confused. Knowing how to add does not make you part of this." Julia spent the afternoon making copies in the back room, and it was there, close to 6, when the store was already empty of customers, that she heard him. Arthur Rivers had arrived without warning to collect Paige, who was fluttering through the showroom, choosing upholstery for the famous apartment. Julia heard him greet everyone in his baritone, heard the laughter, and then heard the particular silence of a man looking at his phone and not wanting to answer. Through the crack in the back room door, she watched him walk toward the corner where the lamp stood, turn his back to the showroom, and answer in a voice lowered by half. "I told you, not this week. Yes, I know perfectly well what date it is." A pause. Arthur's shoulders, so broad at dinners, looked different from behind, burdened. "Do not talk to me about foreclosure. No one is foreclosing on anything, because in 20 days I am signing a transaction that backs everything. Yes, with assets, real estate, inventory, a brand with 40 years of..." Another, longer pause. "Listen carefully. If the bank makes a move before the signing, the deal collapses. And if the deal collapses, you collect smoke. Do you understand? Smoke. Give me 20 days. He ended the call, drew 2 deep breaths, and adjusted his jacket. When he turned back toward the showroom, the smile of a man who owned half the country was once again in place, pressed and perfect. "Paige, sweetheart, have you chosen? Do not choose anything cheap. That is not who we are." Julia stood motionless behind the door, the unfinished copy in her hand. 20 days. A transaction backing everything. Assets. The image of Rebecca burning papers over a candle flame came to her with photographic clarity. Past due. And suddenly, the Caldwell Rivers partnership no longer looked like a business deal. It looked like something else. Two people who could not swim, embracing in the middle of the ocean, each convinced the other was a life preserver. She told no one. Who was there to tell? That night, she simply wrote it in the final page of her notebook, in her small, even handwriting, in the section where she recorded what did not add up, the date, the time, and 4 words. Bank call, AR, smoke. At home, meanwhile, the word of the week was engagement. Rebecca had decided that the signing of the partnership deserved a proper celebration, and that the perfect celebration would be a party in the Shopping Arcades event hall, the public presentation of the Caldwell Rivers Alliance. The details were discussed with cheerful shouting in the dining room, Paige and Emily leafing through magazines while Rebecca made guest lists that always began with last names and never with people. And Brandon will make the toast, Rebecca decided. Beside Paige, of course. Image is everything. The new generation of the two houses, united.
Doesn't that look strange?
Emily asked without raising her eyes from the magazine. I mean, Brandon is still married. The dining room cooled by 1 degree. Julia, passing through the hallway with a cup of tea, stopped without meaning to beside the half-open door. Papers are papers, Rebecca said, lowering her voice into the register of plans. And papers can be fixed. Do not worry about that. I will handle it. It is a matter of days. Mom is right, Paige said, her voice sweet as thick syrup. Besides, the party is soon, and something tells me that by the Friday of the signing, a small pause, the brush of magazine pages, that woman will no longer be here. No one asked how. No one asked why she sounded so certain. Emily turned another page. Rebecca continued with her list, and on the other side of the door, in the dark hallway, Julia stood perfectly still, with the cup burning her hands, understanding that they had just read her sentence, without naming the crime, and that the deadline had a date, Friday. What neither Rebecca nor Paige could imagine was that they were right. That on Friday, Julia truly would no longer be in that house, but forcing her through the door would be the only plan in their lives that went perfectly, and the most expensive. Friday arrived beneath another burdened sky, the same gray as the day of the dinner, but darker and lower, like a ceiling about to collapse. Julia would remember it later. Even the weather had been summoned that night. Brandon did not appear all day. Rebecca had sent him with Paige to a tasting for the partnership engagement party, leaving the house in the hands of the women, Rebecca, Emily, and a strange silence, the kind that makes noise. Julia had felt it since morning. Rebecca gave her no orders. She did not criticize her. She did not look at her. And in 4 years, Julia had learned that Rebecca's indifference was not peace. It was aim. The thunder began at 7 in the evening. At 7:30, Rebecca knocked on Julia's bedroom door. She did not enter shouting. She came in with Paige behind her, just arrived and still wearing her coat, and Emily behind them both, dragged along by the current. Rebecca held her hands folded in front of her and used her most dangerous register, calm. We are going to settle this now, Julia. As a family, she indicated the closet with her chin. The box. What box? Do not insult me. The tin box you have hidden since you came to this house. The one Brandon saw. The one you keep changing from one hiding place to another. Rebecca took a step. My son demands a laboratory test to learn whether that child is his. I am more practical. Women keep their truths in boxes. Open it here, in front of witnesses, and if you have nothing to hide, this family will owe you an apology.
Julia felt cold travel down her spine.
There was the trap, perfect and complete. The only proof of her innocence was to break the promise made to her mother in a hospital bed. Rebecca could not have known it, but blindly she had aimed at the one place where Julia could not yield. That box belonged to my mother. It contained sealed letters she left me, with a promise that I would not open them until... She stopped. Explaining would mean bleeding out in front of them. I will not open it. Not today and not in front of you. It has nothing to do with Brandon or my daughter. Sealed letters. Paige let out a small laugh and examined her nails. How convenient. Did her mother write them, or is someone more current writing them? Because for someone with nothing to hide, you defend that lock with your entire body, dear. Do you see, Emily? Rebecca turned slightly toward her daughter, using her as a witness the way one uses a weapon. Do you see what this is? I took in this woman with no last name, no dowry, no history. I gave her a roof, a name, a family, and she repays me with secrets under lock and key in my own house. Emily said nothing. She looked at the tin box Julia had taken from the closet and now pressed against her chest, and she looked at her sister-in-law's face, and for the second time in a week, something inside her hesitated. But Emily's hesitations were cowardly birds. They fluttered and returned to the cage. Last chance, Rebecca said. Open it. No. The word fell whole, alone, without ornament, and Rebecca smiled, because it was exactly the word she had come to find. Then there is nothing more to discuss. She turned toward the door and raised her voice to the hallway, to the world. A liar will not sleep one more night in this house. Emily, bring the large suitcase from the hall. Paige, dear, help me with the closet. What followed, Julia experienced the way accidents are experienced, in fragments. Paige tearing her clothes from the hangers by the armful, with the poorly concealed delight of someone finally allowed to touch another person's belongings in order to throw them away. Julia's maternity clothes falling into the open suitcase, mixed with the baby's booties. Emily, pale, obeying in slow motion. Julia herself struggling to rescue the ultrasound envelope, the crib fund from the sewing box, and the tin box no one managed to take, because she held it the way one holds a newborn, and Rebecca directing everything from the center of the room without touching a thing, like an orchestra conductor. Rebecca, for God's sake, it is raining, Emily said at one point, very quietly beside the window. At least let her wait until it stops. Water cleans, her mother replied. At 8:20 that night, the apartment door slammed behind Julia. The elevator carried her down 3 floors, already soaked in dry tears, the kind that do not wet the face. And when she crossed the lobby and stepped into the street, the sky finally released everything it had been holding. The suitcase fell first. They had shoved it down behind her, and it struck the wet pavement, sprang half open, and the knitted cap rolled into the puddle. Julia walked slowly down the steps, one hand on her back and the other on her belly, while the rain plastered her hair against her face. Above her, Rebecca stepped onto the 3rd-floor balcony to admire her work, dry, arms crossed. There is no place for liars in this family, she said without shouting, because the entire street was silent to hear her, and even less for children with an unknown father. Behind the curtains, the neighbors, the 1st-floor light switching off so someone could see better. No one came out. Julia bent down, picked up the soaked little cap, and pressed it to her chest. She found the locket with her fingers and closed her eyes. And then one door did open, the lobby door. Frank crossed the rain without an umbrella for himself, because the only umbrella he carried was open in his hand, and it was for Julia. He held it above her, picked up the suitcase, and snapped it shut with one strike of his knee. Come with me, ma'am, inside. You are not staying in this rain for another minute. Frank! Rebecca's voice fell from the balcony like a bucket of water colder than the rain. That woman no longer belongs in this building. If you bring her into the lobby, I will speak to management tomorrow morning and you will be gone too. Frank lifted his head toward the balcony. 60 years old, drenched, someone else's suitcase in his hand. And he answered with the intact dignity of those who have lost almost everything except their sense of shame. The lobby belongs to the building, Mrs. Caldwell, and the building does not belong to you. As far as I know, you are a tenant too. Then, lowering his voice for Julia alone, he said, Come. Eleanor is already heating water. He helped her cross, and it was at that moment, with Julia beneath the umbrella halfway across the sidewalk, Rebecca still on the balcony, and half a dozen open curtains like theater boxes, that yellow headlights swept across the wet street. A long, silent black car was moving slowly through the rain. It passed the building. It stopped. Without hurry, it backed up exactly the necessary distance until it stood directly in front of the lobby, and the rear window began to lower. For a long moment, no one got out. There was only the rear window, halfway open beneath the rain, and inside, a still shadow watching the balcony, where Rebecca, suddenly uncomfortable without knowing why, stepped back and shut the glass door, watching the partly open curtains close one by one like guilty eyes. And above all, watching the pregnant woman beneath the doorman's umbrella, a broken suitcase at her feet, and a baby cap pressed to her chest. Then the car door opened, and the driver managed to come around carrying an umbrella, but the man had already stepped out without waiting for him. He was an older gentleman, tall, in a gray hat and a dark overcoat of a kind no longer made. He appeared to be in his early 70s, but he moved with the economy of gesture of men who have never needed to hurry. He crossed the sidewalk beneath the rain, as though the rain itself did not quite dare touch him, and stopped 2 steps from Julia and Frank. "Good evening, Frank," he said. His voice was deep and dry, with sand beneath it. "Good evening, sir." Frank straightened abruptly, and Julia saw something on his face she had never seen before. Recognition and astonishment together. The expression of a man watching a legend walk through the door. "Sir, the lady is a resident of the building. Or was, I mean. I saw enough." The man was not looking at Frank. He was looking at Julia, and he looked at her in a strange way, too fixed for courtesy, the way one looks at something that hurts. "Are you all right? The child?" "We are fine," Julia said with what remained of her voice. "Thank you." That is not true, but it is brave. The man glanced for 1 second toward the empty third-floor balcony, and something crossed his face, an old shadow. "Who threw you out?" "Sir, it was Mrs. Caldwell from the 3rd floor," Frank said. "She threw her out like this, in her condition, over an outrage, sir, because this lady is the most decent person ever to set foot in this building, and I tell you that as a man who has worked in that lobby 20 years, and if defending her means I have to leave too, then I will leave with my head. No one is going anywhere, Frank." He did not raise his voice, yet the words landed like a gavel striking a table. The matter was closed. "Take her inside. Let her warm up. I will wait." Eleanor received her in the doorman's booth with a towel, and that gift older women have for turning a few square feet into a country. She removed Julia's soaked coat, seated her beside the electric heater, placed a blanket over her legs and a cup in her hands, all while quietly scolding the rain, the Caldwells, and the world. The man in the hat entered last and removed it. He had abundant white hair and thick eyebrows over dark eyes, then remained standing, suddenly uncomfortable inside so much small warmth, like a ship in a bathtub. "Sit down, sir, for heaven's sake," Eleanor said, bringing forward the best chair. He sat across from Julia. The heater hummed. Outside, the rain, and the man continued looking at her with that pained intensity until he seemed to realize it and lowered his eyes to the cup Eleanor placed before him. "Forgive me. I am staring like a rude man. It is only that you—" He stopped and searched carefully for the words, like someone walking on ice. "You remind me of someone. I must have a common face," Julia said, attempting a smile. "No," he said it too quickly, too seriously. "Not common." The silence stretched. Julia drank. Warmth was returning her body to her, and with her body came the humiliation of the spectacle, the suitcase, the balcony, everything. She raised her hand to her neck in that familiar gesture, reaching for the locket the way one reaches for shore, and the world stopped. Because the man saw the locket. Julia knew by the sound, his cup trembling briefly against its saucer. She raised her eyes and found the man in the hat transformed, pale beneath his weathered skin, his eyes fixed on the small piece of worn gold hanging from her neck, one hand suspended halfway through a gesture he never completed. "Where did—" His sandy voice broke. He had to begin again. "Where did you get that locket?" "It belonged to my mother." Julia instinctively covered it with her hand. "It is the only thing she left me." "Open it." "Excuse me?" "It has a clasp. Here, on the side. One that sticks and has to be pressed twice." He described it without seeing it, closing his eyes for an instant, like someone reading words written inside himself. "There is room for 2 portraits, but the frame on the left is scratched because the jeweler was an idiot and I—" He stopped abruptly. Julia's hands felt cold again, and it was not the rain. With clumsy fingers, she found the side of the locket, the clasp she knew by heart, the one that stuck and had to be pressed twice. The lid sprang open. On the right was the familiar tiny, faded photograph. Her mother young, almost a girl, laughing. On the left was nothing, only the empty frame, scratched. The man stared at the open locket and breathed as though the air had grown scarce. Eleanor and Frank stood motionless beside the heater, understanding nothing and understanding everything, the way people understand earthquakes. "Sir, who are you?" Julia asked in a thread of a voice. He did not answer that. He asked something else, and the question came out, carrying more fear than his body could hold. The fear of a man who has waited 28 years for an answer and suddenly does not know whether he can survive it. "What was your mother's name?" Outside, thunder rolled for a long time over the city, while Julia, not knowing that 2 words would divide everyone's story into a before and an after, answered, "Audrey." Her name was Audrey. The man closed his eyes. He remained that way for a long time, the open locket shining between them in the heater's glow. And when he opened them again, Julia saw something she had not expected to see in a gentleman with a hat and a black car. The wet eyes of an old man who no longer knows how to cry, that arrested moisture in men taught to swallow tears. "Audrey?" he repeated. The way one repeats a name one has carried for 28 years without daring to say aloud. "Audrey what?" "Audrey Parker." Parker. A bitter smile touched his mouth. Her nanny's last name. She took the name of the woman who raised her. Of course she did. Even in running away, she had a better heart than I did. He rose from the chair. In the tiny doorman's booth, he seemed even larger and suddenly much older. He walked 2 steps toward the glass door, looked at the rain, and spoke to the glass. Because some things cannot be said while looking at people. "I had that locket made, miss, 50 years ago for my wife. When she died, I gave it to my only daughter on her 15th birthday. Her mother's portrait was on the right, mine was on the left. A pause, rain striking the glass. I see my daughter removed the half she no longer needed. Julia could not move. The words reached her one at a time, like drops through a leaking ceiling. Wife, only daughter, 15 years old. Frank had removed his cap without realizing it and was twisting it in his hands. It was Eleanor, with the practical courage of women who have accompanied much death and much life, who asked the question no one else dared. "Sir, who are you?" The man turned around. He looked at Julia, only at her, and said it to her. "My name is Samuel Whitmore. This building is mine. The shopping arcade on the corner is mine. 6 streets in this city carry my signature on their deeds." He listed these facts without pride, as someone might list scars. "And all of that together is worth nothing, miss. Because 28 years ago my daughter Audrey left my house on a rainy night like this one, pregnant, carrying a suitcase, and I," his sandy voice dissolved completely, "I was the man on the balcony." The silence that followed was so vast that the heater could be heard. Julia gripped the locket in both hands, while everything spun and fitted together at once. Her mother's silences, the doors I closed to protect you, sewing for strangers in rented rooms, the tin box, open them on the day you cannot take any more, and this gentleman in a hat who asked doormen whether tenants were happy and never raised the rent on long-time residents, because of a promise. "The promise," Julia said suddenly, aloud without intending to. "Frank told me that you never raise the rent on long-time tenants because of a promise. To whom did you make it?" "To no one. That is the point." Samuel sat heavily across from her again. "It was an oath made to absence. When I understood that my daughter was not coming back, not answering my letters, not forgiving me, I searched for her in 3 countries. Detectives, notices, money, nothing. Audrey knew how to disappear. She learned it from me, because I taught her to leave no trail in business." He looked at his large hands, stained by age. "Then I was left with this, buying old buildings and not squeezing anyone. I told myself, if my daughter is living somewhere, let her be the tenant of a man unlike the one I was. Let no one throw her out because she cannot make the month's rent. Let no one humiliate her from a balcony. He raised his eyes. 28 years waiting to repay a debt to a stranger. And tonight I am driving down one of my streets in this cursed rain that always reminds me of her. And I see the same scene on the sidewalk. Identical. The suitcase, the belly, the balcony. I got out because my soul could not bear to pass by twice in one lifetime. And the stranger is wearing my wife's locket. He looked at Julia's belly, and then at her face, feature by feature, with that pained intensity that now had a name. Where is your mother, miss? Where is my daughter? And Julia understood that the night had not finished breaking hearts, because now it was her turn. Her turn to tell this man, who had waited 28 years, that he had arrived 8 years too late. She died, sir, 8 years ago. Cancer. She went peacefully in a public hospital, holding my hand. Julia swallowed. By a miracle, her voice emerged whole. She never spoke to me about you. She never told me her maiden name. She left only the locket, and a box of sealed letters she made me swear not to open, until the day I could not take any more. Samuel Whitmore received the news the way an oak receives lightning, without moving, burning on the inside. He remained silent so long that Eleanor began praying softly. When he spoke, the voice came from the bottom of a mine. 8 years. I have spent 8 years looking for a dead woman. Then, with infinite care, pointing toward the broken suitcase beside the door, he asked, "That box, is it there?" "It is here." Julia took it from among her clothes, where she had protected it from the water with her own coat. The dented tin, the faded ribbon. "I have never opened it." "And tonight, miss," Samuel leaned forward, and for the first time all night there was pleading in the most feared man in the city. 7 months pregnant, thrown into the rain, homeless, without a husband, with nothing but what you are wearing. If tonight is not the day when you cannot take any more, that day does not exist. Julia looked at the box. She looked at Frank and Eleanor, who nodded slowly, their eyes bright. She looked at the grandfather who had just found her at the edge of the same storm in which he had lost his daughter, and with fingers that were no longer cold, she untied the ribbon her mother had knotted before she died. See, inside were 11 numbered envelopes written in Audrey's round, patient hand, and on top of them all was one without a number, bearing 2 words on the front that made Samuel Whitmore, 72 years old, and owner of half the city, cover his mouth with one hand like a child. For Dad. Samuel took the envelope in both hands, as one takes an injured bird. He looked at it for a long time, turned toward the window, and no one thought of moving while the most feared man in the city tore the paper open with clumsy fingers and read with his back to them, beneath the poor light of the doorman's booth. The letter was not long. Julia knew from the time it took, but Samuel read it 3 times, and on the third, the broad shoulders beneath his dark coat began to tremble without sound, the way buildings tremble inside before anyone notices from outside. When he finally turned around, his face was wet and he did not even try to hide it. He held the letter out to Julia. "Read it. It belongs to you more than to me." Her mother's round handwriting, the yellowed paper. Julia read softly, and the words came to her in Audrey's voice, that voice of long silences. "Dad, if you are reading this, the only thing I ever asked of God has happened, that someday, somehow, my daughter would reach you. I am leaving too soon, and I take with me half of an argument neither of us remembers completely anymore. You said that man would abandon me. You were right, he left me after 3 months. I said I would never come back to ask you for anything. I was right too. Pride is inherited, Dad, like lockets. I did not return because of pride. Then I did not return because of shame. And in the end, I did not return because I no longer knew how. But listen to the only thing that matters. Her name is Julia. She is better than you and me together. She knows nothing, so she could grow up without hating you and without waiting for you. If one day she stands before you, do not ask her forgiveness for what you did to me. Just take care of her the way we failed to take care of each other, and tell her that I closed every door except one. I left yours ajar. Audrey." In the doorman's booth, not even the heater could be heard. Eleanor wept openly, holding her headscarf in one hand. Frank stared at the floor, his jaw clenched. Julia folded the letter with infinite care, and when she raised her eyes, she found her grandfather's waiting for her, without a hat, without buildings, without anything. An old man with empty hands before the only family he had left. "I will not ask you to love me, miss," Samuel said, his voice broken but dignified. "I will not even ask you to forgive me on anyone's behalf. I will ask you for 3 smaller things. A roof tonight, yours, in my house, which is large and empty. A doctor tomorrow, because you have been wet for hours, and that child comes first. And time, whatever amount you decide. Even if it is the time required for 1 cup of tea each week. I can rebuild anything with that." Julia looked at the letter in her hands. "I left yours ajar," and she gave the only answer that could be given. "For tonight, yes. The rest? We will see about the rest, Mr. Whitmore." Samuel," he nearly pleaded. "At least Samuel. We will see about that too." And for the first time all night, the old man smiled. A brief smile at one corner of his mouth, so much like the smile in the locket photograph that Julia's chest tightened. Before leaving, Samuel stopped in front of Frank. He looked him up and down, still drenched, his cap twisted in his hands. 20 years in this lobby, correct? 21 in March, sir. Tonight you crossed the rain for a tenant who had been thrown out, knowing it could cost you your job." Samuel put on his hat. "Management will call you Monday. Not for the reason the lady on the 3rd floor believes. Good evening, Frank. Good evening, Mrs. Eleanor. Those flower pots still hold the finest flowers in all 22 of my buildings." Samuel Whitmore's house stood high above the city, behind a black gate and a garden the rain made shine. It was enormous and, as he had said, empty. An older housekeeper appeared in her robe and crossed herself with emotion upon being told to prepare the large bedroom, the one with the fireplace. Hallways sat with their lights turned off, and on the walls, pale rectangles marked where paintings had been removed years earlier. On the staircase landing, only one remained. A 15-year-old girl laughing, a gold locket around her neck. Julia stopped before it. Samuel stopped behind her. "I ordered everyone in the house to take down her face because I could not bear to see it," he said. "I could not take that one down. I command a great deal, miss, but my power did not reach that far." That night, Julia slept in a bed the size of her old room, the tin box on the nightstand, and the baby slowly turning, as though learning the new silence. It was not happy sleep. It was better, sleep without fear. And in the morning, when she came downstairs, she found the breakfast table set for 2, for the first time in 28 years, and Samuel standing at the window, speaking on the telephone with someone named Harris, saying in a sandy voice made firm again, "Everything, Harris. Birth certificate, the young woman's marriage record, and find out under a magnifying glass who those Caldwells are in the building on Sycamore Street, what they own, what they owe, whom they plan to partner with. Do not touch anything yet. First, I want to know exactly what ground they are standing on." A pause. The old man's eyes hardened by 1 degree. "Yes, and one more thing. The lease for the shop in the arcade, the furniture store. Bring me that file personally." He hung up and turned to find Julia in the doorway. He made no attempt to hide what he had been doing. "Does it bother you?" Julia thought of the balcony, the mutilated pay envelope, the yellow sleeper in Paige's hands. Brandon saying that is exactly what this family has been wondering. She poured herself tea with a steady pulse. "Finding out the truth does not hurt anyone," she said. "Not yet." Meanwhile, on Sycamore Street, the 3rd floor awoke to a triumphant Saturday morning. Rebecca inspected Julia's empty room with her hands on her hips and ordered the windows opened so the air of lies could be aired out. Paige arrived at noon with fabric samples for redecorating. And on Monday morning, when Rebecca went down to the lobby, prepared to finish the job, she addressed Frank in her best commanding voice. "I am calling management today about what happened Friday. You know that." "There is no need, ma'am." Frank watered the flower pots without hurry. "Management already called me, early this morning." Something in the doorman's calm threw her off balance. "Oh, good. Then I assume you already know your days here are." "I was offered the position of general building manager, Mrs. Caldwell, with a ground floor apartment for my wife and me." Frank shut off the water, straightened, and looked at her with 21 years of unspoken things in his eyes. And I was asked to inform all the residents that the owner will conduct a complete review of every lease this month, one by one. No one should have any overdue paperwork. Good morning, ma'am. And he returned to his flowers, leaving Rebecca Caldwell motionless in the middle of the lobby, with the strange sensation, for the first time in many years, that the ground beneath her did not belong to her. She still did not know how right she was, or that the word owner, which had just slid past her, wore a locket she had seen 1,000 times without ever looking at it. Attorney Harris proved to be a small, immaculate man with a perfect bow tie and flawless folders, who had spent 40 years guarding Samuel Whitmore's secrets and arranging his papers the way others arrange cathedrals. He arrived Wednesday in the middle of the afternoon, with 2 files under his arm, and an expression Julia would learn to read over time. The left eyebrow raised slightly, which in Harris's language amounted to an entire speech. They settled in the study with the fireplace. Samuel wanted Julia present, and after one questioning glance, Harris opened the first folder. First, the bloodline, because it organizes everything else. He removed stamped documents. Birth certificate of Julia Parker, daughter of Audrey Parker, father not listed. Now, the last name Parker belonged to Rose Parker, a domestic employee who worked in the Whitmore household for 22 years and is now deceased, and who appears as godmother on Audrey Whitmore's baptismal record. The dates, the changes of address for both women, the records from the hospital where Miss Parker was born. Everything matches, Mr. Whitmore. On paper, Audrey Parker and your daughter Audrey are the same person. For the court, this is more than enough to begin recognizing the young lady as your granddaughter. Although, if we wanted absolute closure, I wanted absolute, Samuel said. Not for me, for the vultures. The day this becomes known, half the city will say an opportunist ensnared an old man. I want science, Harris. I want a document no one could dispute, even drunk. A genetic kinship test then. Grandfather and granddaughter. A week. Perhaps 10 days. Harris made a note and looked at Julia delicately. And since the laboratory will already be working, I took the liberty of making inquiries. Mr. Brandon Caldwell has been demanding a paternity test in every social room in the city, with witnesses. We can perform both determinations at once, miss. Stamise go. The same laboratory, the same protocol, the same sealed envelope. You decide. Do it, Julia said, surprised by how calm her own voice sounded. He asked for it in front of everyone. Let the answer reach him in front of everyone too. Harris's left eyebrow rose 1 millimeter. Approval. Second file. He opened it like someone uncovering something foul-smelling. The Caldwells. Mr. Whitmore, in 40 years, I have seen you examine many bankruptcies, but few as well disguised as this one. Caldwell House owes 9 months' rent on the store in the arcade. Management accepted partial payments and promises. Formal notices have gone unanswered. The apartment on Sycamore Street is 6 months behind. Add loans from 2 finance companies, suppliers who no longer deliver without advance payment, and a mortgage on the only property they actually own, a country house, which is delinquent and in proceedings. Mrs. Rebecca has been burning papers, figuratively speaking. Literally too, Julia murmured, remembering the candle, the pot, the word past due, and holding everything up with a single card, the partnership with the Rivers Group, which would contribute fresh capital in exchange for the brand's prestige. The signing is in 2 weeks, with a presentation party in the Arcade's event hall. Harris closed the folder and brought his fingertips together. There is something else, and it is what does not balance. I made a discreet inquiry into the Rivers Group, of simple routine. The routine returned noise. Ugly noise, Mr. Whitmore. Nothing firm yet, but when I ask about a sound company, bankers yawn, and when I asked about Rivers, 2 managers changed the subject with far too much elegance. Julia and her notebook looked at one another, so to speak. She went to her room for it, opened it to the final page, and placed it before Harris, pointing to her small handwriting. The date, the time, bank call, AR, smoke. I heard it myself in the store. He spoke of foreclosures, asked for 20 days, and said that if the bank moved before the signing, they would collect smoke. Harris read it again, and looked over his glasses at Julia with something very close to professional respect. Miss Parker, when this is over, should you want employment, my firm has an open desk. Then, turning to Samuel, he said, "Do you understand what we have, Mr. Whitmore? Two shipwrecked people selling each other a ship neither owns. The Caldwells contribute a bankrupt brand. The Rivers family, capital that does not exist. The party for this signing is not a wedding. It is a train collision with an orchestra." Samuel rose and walked to the window, and Julia watched him make the gesture she already knew, thumbs in his vest pockets, his jaw moving slightly as he chewed over time. When exactly does the lease for the arcade store expire? That is the beautiful part. Harris allowed himself his first smile of the afternoon, as thin as a paper cut. It expired 2 months ago. They are on an automatic extension, revocable with 30 days' notice. And the renewal, Mr. Whitmore, requires the owner's signature. The owner's, Samuel repeated, turning toward Julia with a new expression. Why are both of you looking at me like that? Because on Monday, I began certain proceedings, miss. Samuel sat across from her again, and suddenly he carried the solemnity of a notary's office. The Sycamore Street building and the arcade are in the process of being transferred. Into your name. Do not interrupt me. It is not a gift, it is restitution. Everything I own belonged to Audrey, and everything Audrey had belongs to you, whether through papers today or a will later. It makes no difference. It is a matter of timing. I prefer to see it while I am alive. He raised one hand when she moved to object. You may refuse it once the paperwork is complete, if your pride demands it. You inherited that pride from your mother and she from me, so I will understand. But until then, every decision regarding those properties passes through you, including renewal of the store where Mrs. Caldwell plans to hold her party. Julia stared into the fireplace. She would have liked to taste the sweetness of revenge already served. Instead, she felt the cold weight of an enormous key suddenly placed in her hand. She thought of the saleswomen in the store, the cook they no longer paid, the upholsterer. If I close the store, what happens to the employees? Harris and Samuel exchanged a glance. In their shared language, that question, the first she had asked, was worth more than the laboratory test. The bloodline had just confirmed itself. Meanwhile, on Sycamore Street, Rebecca Caldwell was fighting her own war on 2 fronts. The first was panic over the papers. Management had sent, as Frank announced, a notice summoning her to a lease review, and Rebecca had hidden it at the back of a drawer beneath her jewelry box, as though problems died from lack of air. The second front was worse, the silence in the street. The story of the pregnant woman thrown into the rain had traveled faster than the story of the mysterious box, and now voices lowered at the bakery when Rebecca entered. Emily was the one who dared mention it on Thursday evening, while her mother reviewed the party guest list for the 10th time. Mom, people are talking. About Friday. They say you threw Julia out while she was pregnant, in the rain, and that even the doorman, and, Rebecca did not look up from the list. If she appears somewhere, or if someone from the Rivers family hears that version, I do not know. It looks bad. Arthur said you sign with clean families. Rebecca set down the pen, and for once, Emily watched her mother truly think. That cold, rapid calculation, that was the only tireless thing in her. You are right, she finally said. We are missing the official version. She opened the desk drawer, took out fine stationery, and handed it to her daughter along with the pen. You have a young woman's handwriting. Write what I dictate. We are going to establish that the woman left on her own. A farewell letter. She departed of her own free will, acknowledges that the child is not Brandon's, apologizes, and asks us not to search for her. We date it Friday, leave it in her room as though we have just found it, and if anyone asks, the letter speaks for us. Emily looked at the paper, she looked at the pen, she looked at her mother. Mom, that is forgery. It is a crime, and it is a lie. It is protecting this family, which is the only thing I have ever done in my life. Rebecca's voice dropped into the tone that moved furniture in that house. Or would you prefer to tell Arthur Rivers the truth? Do you want to still have a last name next month, Emily? Right. And that night, While the house slept, Emily Caldwell wrote under dictation the letter of an innocent woman, her hand growing colder and colder, while one sentence from her mother repeated inside her, a sentence Rebecca spoke at the end, as she reread the forgery with satisfaction, not knowing she was dictating her own sentence as well. Perfect! After all, who is going to come forward and contradict it? That penniless woman? And with what witnesses? Emily folded the letter, and for the third time in 2 weeks, the bird fluttered in her chest. Only this time, instead of returning to the cage, it remained on the windowsill, watching the door. But that same night, long after the false letter had been put away in the desk, Emily went downstairs for a glass of water and found the kitchen light on. Her mother sat at the table with her hair uncombed, an open shoebox before her, and photographs scattered around it. She did not hear Emily arrive, and so Emily saw what she should not have. Rebecca Caldwell holding an old photograph with her guard lowered, completely lowered, for the first time in her daughter's memory. "Mom?" Rebecca started, and her first reaction was to cover the photographs with her arm like a student hiding an exam. Then she seemed to surrender. It was late, she was tired, and even generals sleep. She pushed one photograph across the table. "Your grandmother Margaret," she said, "at the store's entrance on opening day." Emily sat down slowly. In the photograph, a woman with a severe bun and a hard mouth posed in front of the freshly painted Caldwell House sign, with a boy in short pants standing stiff as a toy soldier on one side and a girl with braids half a step behind on the other, almost outside the frame. "The one who is barely visible is me," Rebecca said. "Look closely, because that is the story of my life in one photograph. Your grandmother Margaret served me cold soup for 30 years, in front of guests, so I would learn my place. The store was for your uncle, because he was the son, and I was the decoration that had to marry well. Do you know what she used to tell me? A woman without a last name is a table without a tablecloth. People set anything they please on top of her." Rebecca gave a short laugh with nothing inside it. "Then your uncle ran off after some nobody, bankrupted everything he touched, and your grandmother had to hand the store to me, the table without a tablecloth, because she had no alternative. And do you know what she said the day she gave me the keys? She did not say thank you. She did not say forgive me. She said, do not lose it, because it is the only thing that makes you somebody." She remained staring at the photograph, and Emily, who had come for a glass of water, forgot her thirst, because she suddenly understood things. The anniversary dinnerware, the chandeliers, the terror of the word bankrupt, the soup her mother forced Julia to serve. "Mom!" You did to Julia exactly what Grandma did to you. The silence lasted 1 heartbeat. 2. Rebecca gathered the photographs with quick hands, placed them in the box, closed the lid, and when she rose from the table she was herself again, pressed, upright, waterproof. "I did what had to be done so this family would never eat cold soup again. You will understand when you have something to lose. Turn off the light when you go upstairs." And she left. Emily remained alone in the kitchen with the empty glass in her hand, understanding for the first time that her mother was not cruel like a storm, which is passing cruelty, but cruel like a scar, a wound that decided to rule. Emily pitied her, and she feared her, because storms stop, but scars do not change their minds. At the house on the hill, meanwhile, the days found a rhythm no one had planned. The doctor came, examined Julia, prescribed modified rest, and declared the baby strong and perfectly positioned, after which Samuel spent 2 days repeating perfectly positioned, as though it were a diagnosis he had invented himself. A laboratory technician, discreet as a shadow, came one morning. 1 swab for Julia, 1 swab for Samuel, and a blood sample from the mother for the baby's prenatal analysis, labeled tubes. For the paternity test, the sample Brandon had already loudly provided at the city's most expensive laboratory was enough, after he demanded a sealed copy, unaware that both analyses would rest in the same file. And in the afternoons, without either of them ever proposing it aloud, they played chess. It began because Julia found the old ivory set in the library, with 1 black rook repaired with glue, and asked who played. "No one for 28 years, the housekeeper said, crossing herself out of habit. That afternoon, Julia set out the pieces. Samuel passed by, looked, grumbled something about no longer having the mind for it, and 10 minutes later he was seated, defeating her with fierce patience. "My daughter moved the knights the same way you do," he said one afternoon during their third game. "Too early and without fear. I always beat her until she was 16. After that, I never beat her again. I should have suspected then that she would escape me from every board." He moved a bishop. Did she laugh? As an adult, I mean. Did she keep her laughter? She did. Julia protected her queen. She laughed quietly, with her hand over her mouth, as though asking permission. But when something truly overcame her, one loud child's laugh escaped, and she frightened herself. Then she laughed at having been frightened. Samuel remained with the bishop halfway through its move, staring at the board without seeing it. And Julia understood what those games were. An old man buying, late and blind, the 28 years he had lost, pawn by pawn, question by question. It was for her to decide the price. She decided to make it cheap. "Check," she announced, moving the knight too early and without fear. "And it is going to cost you, Samuel, because my mother taught me this opening." It was the first time she called him simply by his first name. The old man received it without speaking, the way great things are received. He lowered his head toward the board, and only the tips of his ears betrayed him. On the 9th day of that piece, the piece ended, Harris called. Julia heard from the living room because Samuel had a habit of speaking into the telephone as though telephones did not work, at full volume. "Tell me, Harris, when? Both envelopes? No, do not read it to me. That is not something you read over the phone. I expect you for dinner tonight, and bring everything." "What do you mean, there is something else?" At this point Samuel's voice changed, becoming slow and dangerous. "Repeat that. At what hospital? When?" He hung up. He entered the living room with his brow transformed into a single line, and Julia rose without realizing it, one hand on her belly. "What happened? The results?" "They arrived. Sealed. Harris is bringing them tonight." Samuel drew a breath. She could see him arranging the words so they would do the least possible harm. "But there is something else. Your husband is telling people you disappeared, that you abandoned the marital home. Apparently there is even a letter. Based on that abandonment, his lawyers have prepared papers. An expedited divorce, total surrender, property, name, and shared custody of the baby, conditioned on the famous test. A complete package of capitulation." The old man's jaw moved, chewing something bitter. "And because they do not know where to find you to serve you, they discovered your prenatal appointments. They are waiting for you, Julia. Thursday, at your 34-week appointment, in the clinic hallway, with a notary. To ambush you with papers in front of your doctor, 8 months pregnant, alone." The fire cracked in the fireplace. Julia remained very still, and Samuel, who was beginning to know her, waited for fear, waited for tears, waited to offer lawyers, bodyguards, the cavalry. Instead, he watched her sit slowly in front of the chessboard, study the pieces for a long moment, and raise eyes that were no longer those of the young woman in the lobby. They were the eyes of the woman with the notebook, calm and precise, with a new spark deep inside. "Let them wait for me," she said. "I will go, alone as they believe I am." She picked up the white queen and gently placed it in the center of the board. "Samuel, how quickly can your people complete the transfer of the arcade?" Harris arrived that night, carrying a briefcase, and with his left eyebrow higher than ever. The three of them ate dinner, and at dessert the lawyer moved his plate aside, removed 2 brown paper envelopes, and placed them on the tablecloth like 2 winning cards. The laboratory original, sealed and accompanied by a notarized record. Both determinations in one file, as requested. He pushed it slightly toward the center. "And a certified copy for the party's information. I personally verified the results this afternoon. Would you like to know them?" Samuel looked at Julia. Julia looked at the sealed envelope, its red seal intact. "Tell me only whether there are surprises, counselor." "None, miss. The blood says exactly what you have been saying for 8 months, and what your grandmother left written for you in a locket." Samuel closed his eyes for an instant. When he opened them, he reached across the tablecloth and squeezed Julia's hand once. Hard, without speeches. The Whitmores did not know how to cry, but they squeezed a hand the way others embraced. Then he cleared his throat, became the general again, and indicated the sealed envelope with his chin. That will not be opened. It will sleep in Harris's safe until the night of the party. The young man asked for his test before an audience. He will receive his test before an audience. Then, turning to Julia, he said, "Now to your matter. You asked for speed on the transfer. Harris, where do we stand? The arcade will be registered in the young lady's name on Monday, the building on Wednesday." Harris brought his fingertips together, which means the notice of non-renewal for the store can be signed this very week. 30 days, and Caldwell House is out on the street. If I may make a suggestion, notify them before the party and spare yourself the unpleasantness of attending. The blow is the same. No, Julia said. She said it softly, but both men raised their eyes. If I notify them first, Rebecca will cancel the party, hide the bankruptcy, blame some technicality, and invent another victim. She has been doing it for 30 years. Julia moved her cup aside and rested her hands on the tablecloth, and there again was the woman with the notebook. I do not want the blow, counselor. I want the truth, all of it, together, once, in front of the same people before whom they denied me. After that, I do not need to step on anyone's face. The truth has weight enough on its own. Samuel watched her with his thumbs in his vest, chewing on something that was not time this time. It was pride. Then let me send people, he said. Lawyers, the best. You do not lift a finger. We will. No. And there, Julia smiled for the first time during dinner. Samuel, listen carefully, because this matters between you and me. I do not want it solved for me. I do not want charity. Not even the charity of justice. I want work. She turned toward Harris. You said your firm had an open desk. I accept it. Beginning tomorrow, I am financial advisor to the Whitmore Group for the review of the arcade's contracts, with a salary, hours, and papers. And I will not enter that party as the newly discovered granddaughter or the rejected wife. I will enter working. They humiliated me while I served tables. Let them see me return signing documents. Harris looked at Samuel. Samuel looked at Harris. And the lawyer did something unprecedented in 40 years of perfect bow ties. He laughed, briefly and sincerely, and extended his hand across the tablecloth. Welcome to the firm, advisor. You already know your first file by heart. You wrote it by hand in a worn-covered notebook. Thursday remained. The hallway ambush. She arrived at Dr. Reynolds's office promptly at 10. Julia, wearing her familiar humble coat, chosen with full intention, carrying her purse, and accompanied by no one. She saw them from the far end of the hallway beside the waiting room chairs. Brandon in a suit holding a folder, a notary in a gray tie who looked as though he billed by the hour, and Paige, who had come to watch, seated with crossed legs, as though in a theater box. When they saw her arrive alone, in her old coat with 8 months of pregnancy before her, all three made the same involuntary movement hunters make when the quarry enters the clearing alone. They straightened. Julia! Brandon stepped into her path, his voice rehearsed and loud enough for the entire hallway. Good to find you, since you abandoned the marital home without leaving an address. I abandoned it? She said calmly. You left a letter. Brandon had the minimal decency to blink as he said it. Everything is with the lawyers. This is formal service. The divorce. It is all drafted to make things easy for you. You sign, we end this amicably, and each of us rebuilds a life. The notary will witness it. He held out the folder. Julia took it, sat calmly in a waiting room chair before everyone, and read, page by page, clause by clause, with the same care as at that dinner, while Brandon checked his watch and Paige sighed toward the ceiling. 2 nurses had stopped to watch discreetly. A pregnant woman lowered her magazine. Waiver of all present and future marital property. Julia read aloud, calmly, as though reading a menu. Waiver of the family name, and custody of the child conditioned on the result of a paternity test held by the father. She raised her eyes. Held by the father? The laboratory delivers it to me because I paid for it, Brandon said. Sign, Julia. You have no lawyer, no home, nothing. I am offering you a dignified way out." Then Julia closed the folder, stood up, and smiled at him. Not with anger. With the calm pity cowards alone do not know how to endure. "You are right, Brandon. This must be signed. But not here, hidden in a hallway, the way people do things they are ashamed of." She returned the folder, pressing it gently against his chest. "Sign it in front of people. You and I, with a notary and an audience. At your party. The one in the Arcades event hall. The Grand Caldwell Rivers Partnership. Invitations are all over the city. I will be there that night. And that night, we will sign everything that has to be signed. Everything. You have the word of the woman with nothing." She looked at the notary. "Make a note, since you bear witness. The wife proposes signing at the party. Before witnesses. The husband decides." Against all expectations, the notary made a note. Paige laughed from her theater box. "And who is going to let you in, dear?" "That is the beautiful thing about large parties," Julia said, already walking toward the doctor's office without turning around. "No one knows who will enter until they do." The doctor's door closed behind her. Brandon remained with the folder against his chest, and the uncomfortable feeling that he had won something whose weight felt wrong. The notary billed his hour, and that night, Paige recounted everything to Rebecca through laughter. "The mad woman wants to sign at the party, in public. It could not be better. Complete humiliation, at no cost." Rebecca listened, smiled, and blessed the idea. Let her sign before everyone. A cleaner ending. She was in splendid spirits because the guest confirmations had arrived from the printer that very afternoon, and she read them aloud, as though calling the roll of her own army. Last names, last names, last names. Until she reached a thick, sober card without a crest that made her stop with a small shiver of pleasure. Whitmore Group, confirmed. 2 people. She held it toward the light, incredulous. "Emily, do you understand what this is? The Whitmore Group does not even attend government functions. They own half the city. Do you see? Do you see what the Caldwell name is when it receives the respect it deserves?" She pressed the card to her chest, radiant. "This party will be the most important night of our lives." For once in her life, Rebecca Caldwell was entirely right. The Arcades event hall had not shone like that in 20 years. Rebecca had staked everything, literally everything, on that night. Illuminated crystal chandeliers, 200 white roses, a string quartet on the platform, white-gloved servers, and a wine-colored carpet running from the door. There was press as well. 2 Society magazine photographers and a business columnist, invited by Arthur Rivers, who understood that lies, like buildings, stand better on good foundations of illustrated paper. At 9, the hall was full. Last names, last names, last names. Rebecca, dressed in pearl gray and wearing real pearls. The last ones she had not sold. Sailed among the guests, distributing her display window smile. Arthur Rivers laughed his baritone laugh beside the long table at the rear, dressed in a white tablecloth, where the partnership folders, silver pens, and gray-tied notary waited. At 9:30, Rebecca climbed onto the platform, silenced the quartet with a gesture, and took a glass and the microphone. "Dear friends, tonight we are not celebrating a business transaction. We are celebrating the union of 2 houses, 2 histories, 2 family names that represent the best of this city." Mild applause, raised glasses. "And we are also celebrating, why not say it, the beginning of a new chapter in my family." Her smile turned to Honey. "Paige, my dear, come up. Brandon." The 2 went up arm in arm, he in a tuxedo, she dazzling in red with her hair pinned up, and, across her shoulders for those who knew how to look, a fine wine-colored wool shawl with 2 initials embroidered at one corner. She had worn it on a whim, as a trophy, because it matched. At the foot of the platform, Emily recognized it and felt cold. "Many of you already know her," Rebecca said into the microphone, "and those who do not, meet her and love her as I do, Paige Rivers, who very soon, when the papers follow the hearts, will become the new Mrs. Caldwell." Applause. Flashes. Paige waved like a carnival queen, Brandon raised his glass, and the quartet began a waltz. At that precise moment, By the great entrance to the hall, the hired master of ceremonies struck the floor twice with his staff, purely as a luxury ritual, and announced in a bronze voice, "Mr. Samuel Whitmore, and his financial advisor!" The waltz died halfway through a measure. 200 heads turned at once. Because in that city, Whitmore was not a last name. It was the weather. And through the double doors, the weather entered in person, tall, dressed in dark clothes, white-haired, moving with the unhurried step of a man who had never run. And on his arm, not behind him, on his arm, was a young woman in a simple, elegant midnight blue dress, her hair loose, a gold locket at her neck, carrying 8.5 months of pregnancy like a crown. The silence could be touched. Rebecca, still on the platform with her glass raised, took 3 full seconds to recognize her, because the mind refuses to fit together the pieces that will destroy it. Paige was the one who named her, without a microphone, though half the room heard. "Is that Julia?" "Good evening," Samuel Whitmore said without raising his voice, yet it reached the final white rose. "Do not stop the music for us. We have come for the same thing as everyone else, the signatures." He advanced down the wine-colored carpet with Julia on his arm, and the crowd opened before them like water. The servers stood at attention. The business columnist was already writing in his notebook, and Arthur Rivers stepped forward with an outstretched hand, his commercial instincts howling that tonight he would either save himself or sink completely. "Mr. Whitmore, what an unexpected honor. Arthur Rivers, at your service. I did not know you were acquainted with the young lady." "The young lady is my financial advisor." Samuel shook his hand briefly. "And she knows this business of yours better than anyone in this hall. That is why we came. You see, the group has interests in this arcade. Let us say, very direct ones." Rebecca descended from the platform as quickly as her pearl gray dress allowed, rebuilding her smile in midair, and intercepted them with Brandon behind her. "Mr. Whitmore, welcome. What a pleasure. I am Rebecca Caldwell, your hostess." Then, unable to contain herself, she spoke to Julia in a low voice, sweet with poison. "You. What kind of scheme is this? What have you told this gentleman?" "Good evening, Rebecca," Julia said, composed and clear, without lowering her voice. "I have not told him anything yet. I came to work. The papers speak for themselves. There are no papers of yours here that matter." "There certainly are, ma'am." The new voice was small and polished. Attorney Harris had just materialized beside the long table at the rear, with his briefcase, next to the gray-tied notary, with whom he was already exchanging cards. "In fact, I propose order. Since everyone is here, let the business that summoned this party speak first, then ours. Does that suit you, Mr. Rivers? You sign your partnership, and we serve our notice concerning the store. Everything witnessed, everything proper." "Notice concerning what about the store?" Rebecca's smile remained, but it was muscle alone now. "Rebecca, for God's sake, later," Arthur hissed, smelling danger without locating it. "Mr. Whitmore, a drink? We were just about to proceed to the partnership signatures, a formality between families, you understand." "I understand," Samuel said. "I understand far more than is convenient for you, Rivers. That is why I am going to do you a favor. You do not deserve. Do not sign anything yet." Turning slightly, with the entire hall attentive, he said, "Julia, the files." And there, before 200 family names, the woman who had served that family's tables opened her folder on the white tablecloth beside the silver pens and began speaking in the calm, exact voice of someone who had kept everyone's accounts for 3 years. "Caldwell House owes 9 months' rent on this store, 6 months on the Sycamore Street apartment, holds delinquent loans with 2 finance companies, and has a mortgage in foreclosure. The partnership scheduled to be signed tonight contributes, on the Caldwell side, an insolvent brand." She turned the page without hurry, while the murmur rose like a tide, and Rebecca paled layer by layer. And on the Rivers side, "Enough!" Arthur stepped forward, red-faced. "Who does this woman think she is? This is defamation. It is—" "On the Rivers side," Julia continued without raising her voice, which was worse than a shout. "Capital pledged to banking institutions that began foreclosure proceedings 3 weeks ago. I heard you myself, sir, at the furniture store. asking on the telephone for 20 days, and saying that if the bank moved before the signing, they would collect smoke. It is dated and recorded. It was later verified by the Harris firm through 2 banking inquiries. The entire hall became a hornet's nest. Paige's mother raised a hand to her necklace. The business columnist wrote so quickly, he broke the point of his pencil and took out another. Arthur Rivers opened and closed his mouth. And Rebecca turned toward him with her face undone, suddenly understanding before everyone that she had spent months selling her bankruptcy to another bankrupt man. Is it a lie, Arthur? Tell me it is a lie. With what were you going to capitalize the partnership? With what? And you, Rebecca? Rivers roared, without baritone, laughter, or anything left. 9 months of rent? A mortgage in foreclosure? What were you selling me, you old fraud? A painted sign. Daddy! Paige, livid, pulled at his sleeve. Daddy! The press! Too late. The flashes were already working. 2 shipwrecked people embracing in the middle of the sea had just discovered that neither was the other's life preserver, with an orchestra, white roses, and photographers. And in the middle of the wreck, Brandon Caldwell, who had spent the entire scene retreating step by step, as though backing away from someone else's fire, made the final mistake of his life as an obedient son. He looked for a culprit the size of his fear. He planted himself before Julia, finger raised, his voice breaking with rage. You arranged this circus for revenge. You worked your way into this poor man's house with stories, the same way you worked your way into mine. Tell him who this woman is, an opportunist who cannot even say whose child she is carrying. Silence fell again, this time absolute. Samuel Whitmore took one slow step, and the entire hall held its breath. But Samuel was not the one who spoke. It was Harris. He opened his briefcase with all the calm in the world, and removed a brown paper envelope bearing an intact red wax seal, then raised it to Brandon's eye level. I am delighted you raised the subject, Mr. Caldwell, because, as chance would have it, the test you demanded before witnesses has arrived. And, as chance would also have it, Harris's left eyebrow rose 1 millimeter. This envelope contains 2 answers. And before you ask, sir, your laboratory submitted the profile to the notarized file authorized by the mother. Under notarial protocol, the results are not delivered to the parties. They are delivered to the truth. Mr. Notary, would you do us the honor? You bear witness. The notary took the envelope, examined it, displayed the intact seal to all 4 corners of the hall like an honest magician, and opened it with a silver letter opener someone handed him from the signing table. He unfolded the record, he adjusted his glasses, and he read in that neutral notary's voice that makes even a grocery list sound solemn. Central Genetics Laboratory. Dual file, notarial protocol. First determination, paternity. Analysis of samples from Mr. Brandon Caldwell and the unborn child carried by Mrs. Julia Parker. Compatibility of 99.99%. He raised his eyes for an instant. Mr. Caldwell is the father. There is no room for dispute. The murmur ran through the hall like gunpowder. Brandon opened his mouth. Nothing emerged. Paige moved her hand 2 inches away from his arm. Barely 2 inches. But in Paige's language, those 2 inches were a relocation. And the notary, implacable, moved to the second page. Second determination, maternal line kinship. Analysis of samples from Mrs. Julia Parker and Mr. Here the notary blinked, reread, and his neutral voice broke from pure surprise. Mr. Samuel Whitmore. Grandfather-granddaughter compatibility confirmed, 99.98%. And there, at that exact point, the name Whitmore did what lightning does to old trees. The hall erupted. Paige's mother dropped toward a chair that was not behind her and was caught by a server. The columnist broke his second pencil. Rebecca Caldwell heard the phrase grandfather and granddaughter, looked at Julia, looked at Samuel, looked at the gold locket at her daughter-in-law's neck, the locket she had seen 1,000 times without ever looking at it, and physically felt the floor of the hall, the arcade, Sycamore Street, the entire city, disappear beneath her feet. No, she murmured. No, this is staged, this. The woman you threw into the rain when she was 7 months pregnant, Samuel Whitmore said. And now he did raise his voice, and the sandy voice filled the hall to the crystal chandeliers. "Is my granddaughter, the daughter of my daughter Audrey, the only family I have left on this earth." He turned slowly, searching for Rebecca, and found her. "And I was on the street that night, ma'am. I saw you on the balcony. I heard you say there was no place for liars in your family. She abandoned the marital home." Rebecca clung to the final plank of the shipwreck and shouted it to the entire hall, pointing at Julia with an extended arm. "There is a letter, written in her own hand and left in her room. She admits she left willingly, that the child was not my Brandon's. I have it. I have it stored away, and I can bring it." "Bring it," Julia said calmly. "I will, before a judge if necessary." "There will be no need to travel that far, ma'am," Harris said, removing another folder from the briefcase, because that night, Harris's briefcase was like a magician's hat. "First, I possess a certified copy of the register maintained for 21 years by the manager of the Sycamore Street building, who is present here tonight, and whose rigor would shame many notaries." And then the hall discovered Frank standing beside a column in a pressed dark suit, uncomfortable and dignified, with Eleanor on his arm. The record states, with date and time, on the Friday in question at 8:22 in the evening, Mrs. Julia Parker leaves the building accompanied by her luggage, carried down by third parties under rainfall. With this observation by the manager, which I quote exactly: "The lady on the third floor threw her out. The baby nearly arrived on the sidewalk. May God forgive all of us who watched." A low, ugly murmur crossed the hall. The 200 family names began looking at Rebecca the way people look at an accident. "A resentful doorman," Rebecca gasped. "The word of an employee against—" "Second," Harris continued, unruffled. "The letter. The one you can bring. I suggest you do not bring it, ma'am, and I will explain why. Because the firm already knows of its existence, its content, and its handwriting. And that handwriting, Mrs. Caldwell, is not my client's. It is her writing. Anyone can see it is mine." The voice came from the foot of the platform, small at first, and then not. Emily Caldwell stepped forward, white as her mother's roses, her hands clenched to stop their trembling, and said it facing the hall, facing the flashes, facing Rebecca. "I wrote the letter, at my mother's dictation." On the following Thursday night, at the dining room desk, on the house's cream stationery, Julia never wrote anything, and never abandoned anything. We threw her out. I carried her suitcase to the door. Her voice broke. She continued anyway. "And I have not slept for days, Mom. You can live with the things we do. I do not know how." "Emily," Rebecca said it in a whisper that was an order, the last order. "Be quiet. Think of your last name." "I am thinking about it, for the first time." Emily turned toward Julia, tears now running without permission. "And there is something else that belongs to you." She crossed the distance to Paige, who watched the scene petrified, and with both hands, without violence and without asking permission, removed the wine-colored shawl from her shoulders. She folded it the way one folds something sacred, and placed it in Julia's arms over her belly. "From your mother, for your daughter. I am sorry. The word is not enough, but it is the one I have. I am sorry." Julia received the shawl. AP, embroidered in one corner. Her chin trembled once, for the first time that night, and she embraced the wool against her belly, where the baby, as though understanding, pushed gently. She looked at Emily and did not say, "I forgive you," because Julia knew those words are earned with time, not scenes. She said something better. "Clothes know who they belong to. I told you. Do you remember?" Then, quietly, for Emily alone, she added, "What you did today erases nothing, but it begins something. That is enough for me." "How touching," Rebecca's voice cracked, hoarse and undone. It was the sound of a woman who had nothing left except the height from which to fall. "Very touching. But this is still my party, in my hall, in my arcade, and I am going to ask everyone present to—" "Ma'am." Harris barely raised one hand, holding the final folder in the other. "Exactly. Since you insist, let us discuss the word my. Here I have the formal notice we came to deliver tonight. along with the deeds registered this week with the county recorder. The store beneath our feet, the entire arcade, and the building on Sycamore Street have had, since Monday, one new and sole owner. He turned toward Julia with the half-bow of an old-fashioned notary. "With your permission, ma'am, you may say the name, or I will." And Rebecca Caldwell, who in 4 years had never asked her daughter-in-law anything, finally asked her a question in a thread of a voice before 200 witnesses. "Who?" "Me, Rebecca," Julia said. "The liar from the balcony. You are standing in my house." The silence following that sentence differed from every other silence of the night. It was not shock, it was adjustment. 200 people rapidly rearranging in their minds who was who in that city from that minute forward. Julia let the silence pass. She did not savor it. She used it. She turned toward the long signing table, placed her folder beside the silver pens Rebecca had rented for another story, and spoke in her working voice, that calm, exact voice no one in the hall now dared call little numbers. "And as the owner, I will sign tonight. Not what you planned, what is proper. Counselor, notary, in order." Harris opened the first folder. 1. Notice of non-renewal of the commercial lease for the premises occupied by Caldwell House, with 9 monthly payments overdue. Statutory period, 30 days. He placed it before Rebecca beside a pen. "Sign to acknowledge receipt, ma'am. Receipt only. Nothing else requires your agreement." Rebecca looked at the paper. She looked around the hall for a single pair of allied eyes, and found backs. The family names, with the infallible instinct of family names, had already regrouped far from her in circles that watched her from shore. "Where do I sign, ma'am?" And the word ma'am, spoken to her daughter-in-law for the first time in 4 years, cost Rebecca Caldwell more than the entire signature. She signed. Her hand danced across the R. 2, Harris continued. Settlement of employment accounts. The company's accounting records, supported by the notebook, establish the improper withholding of Mrs. Julia Parker's wages, including the celebrated vase, whose purchase invoice, describing the pre-existing crack, is copied in the appendix. The total owed with interest appears on the statement. It will be deducted from the store's security deposit. His left eyebrow rose 1 millimeter. "The vase is expensive for you, ma'am." 3, Julia said, setting the papers aside and looking directly at Rebecca. "The part no one signs. From a balcony, in front of all my neighbors, you called me a liar and called my daughter a child with an unknown father. The neighbors heard the accusation. They will hear the answer. The laboratory record and the building register will be displayed in management for 30 days, available to every tenant. I do not ask you to apologize. Dictated apologies are worth nothing, and you know that better than anyone. You dictated one. I ask only that every person who heard you read. The truth does not need a balcony." Rebecca did not answer. She stared at the statement of her debts with the eyes of someone watching the sea from a sinking ship, and when she finally spoke, she did not speak to Julia. She spoke to the hall, to no one, to the air. "For 30 years, I held up this family name. 30 years, alone." "I know," Julia said, without irony, which was the terrible part. "I know about the cold soup, Rebecca. I know about your mother and the keys. Emily told me last night when she came to confess about the letter." Julia lowered her voice. This was for Rebecca alone, though the entire hall could read her lips. "You spent your whole life knowing what it meant to be treated like a table without a tablecloth, and when you had a daughter-in-law, you chose to become your mother with a different face. That is your tragedy, and I would not wish it on anyone, but my daughter will not inherit it. That is where your story and mine separate. I am not like you." She stepped away. Rebecca remained beside the table in her pearl gray dress, and real pearls, perfectly dressed and perfectly alone, which, though no one said it, was the most exact sentence of the night. 4. Harris turned toward Brandon, who had spent 10 minutes attempting to become invisible inside a tuxedo. "Mr. Caldwell, you brought to Thursday's medical appointment a divorce agreement requiring the lady's total surrender. Before witnesses, she proposed signing it here tonight, in public. We have complied. Here is the divorce, redrafted, naturally, by our firm." He slid the folder across the tablecloth. Dissolution of the marriage. Acknowledgement of paternity in accordance with the genetic record, with the child support required by law, not $1 less, because children are not negotiated. And concerning the property, Harris permitted himself an artist's pause. The marital estate is dissolved according to the real inventory. Debts, sir, are shared. Welcome to half of everything your mother owes. Brandon read and gradually turned the color of the tablecloth. He raised his eyes toward Julia, and for the first time in years, they held something resembling sight. He was seeing her. The blue dress, the locket, the new last name that was the oldest of all. The woman who had stood beside him for 4 years, while he looked through her. "Julia!" he began, and his voice came out in the tone from their courtship, the tone he saved for asking. You and I could talk, alone. All of this got out of hand, my mother, the pressure of the signing. I never wanted. You signed the swab with more enthusiasm than you signed the marriage certificate, Brandon. Julia said it without anger, with the same calm pity she had shown in the waiting room. I am not going to make a scene. I am going to give you something better than a scene. Precision. As a father, you have a door. It opens through years, presence, support paid on time, and respect for your daughter's mother. If one day the child asks me about you, I will not lie to her, either in your favor or against you. You build whatever she finds behind that door, beginning today. As a husband, she took the silver pen, signed all 3 copies in her small, even handwriting, and offered him the pen. As a husband, sign here. It is the only thing I ask of you in front of people. End this, before the same people who watched you doubt me. Brandon signed, and when he raised his eyes in search of Paige, hoping at least to leave on the arm of accompanied defeat, he found the space where Paige had stood. He saw her far away, crossing the hall behind her father, with her mother in tow, all 3 rivers retreating toward the double doors beneath the eyes of 200 witnesses and the punctual flash of the photographers. At the door, Paige turned one final time. She did not look at Brandon. She appraised the entire hall, the lost party, the sunken family name, the bare shoulders where the shawl no longer rested, and she left. Some people love the way they invest, and Paige Rivers had just withdrawn her funds. 5, Samuel Whitmore said then, his sandy voice lowering the curtain on the Caldwells and raising another. The final matter tonight, and the only one signed with pleasure. Frank, Eleanor, please come forward. The couple crossed the hall through people who now moved aside respectfully, still not understanding, Frank twisting not his cap now but the knot of his tie. Harris opened the final folder. Appointment as lifetime general manager of the group's properties, with lifelong housing on the ground floor of the Sycamore Street building, he read, and establishment of a health fund in Mrs. Eleanor Dawson's name, covering her complete treatment, past and future, with the best medicine in this city. Signed this afternoon by the owner. Harris looked over his glasses at Frank. She personally drafted the clause explaining the reason. I quote, for 21 years of maintaining the only register in this building in which rent was never recorded, and truth always was. And for an umbrella. Frank could not sign immediately because he could not see the line. Eleanor held his hand, and they signed together, crooked and wet, and that crooked paper was worth more than all the silver pens on the table. Julia embraced them both, and the hall, which had spent the night learning who was who, applauded for the first time for something that deserved it. And now, Samuel said, taking a glass from the tray of a motionless server, the toast this party was owed, not to the 2 houses, to the only one that remained standing. He raised his glass toward Julia, and the most feared old man in the city smiled with the corner smile from the locket photograph. To my granddaughter, who came into this family the way truths arrive, late, drenched, and here to stay. 1 month later, the rain returned to the city. But this time, it arrived gently before dawn, almost asking permission, and struck the windows of a private clinic where a 72-year-old man walked the hallway with his hat in his hand, counting floor tiles the way lost years are counted, while beyond a white door, his granddaughter brought the 4th woman of the family into the world. Audrey was born at 6:10 in the morning with the first light. She weighed what she should, cried as loudly as she wished, and when the nurse asked for the name to place on the bracelet, Julia said it in full, slowly. savoring every word the way one savors a settled debt. Audrey. Audrey Parker Whitmore. At her mother's express request, they wrapped her in a fine, wine-colored wool shawl with 2 initials embroidered in one corner. The dead grandmother embraced the living granddaughter, as promised. And when Samuel was allowed in, the old man stopped at the door with his hat pressed to his chest, the way Frank had twisted his cap, not daring to take the step until Julia, from the bed, raised the sleeping child and spoke the words 28 years, 2 storms, and 1 locket had been waiting for. "Come, Grandpa. Come meet your great-granddaughter." Grandpa. Samuel Whitmore crossed the room the way one crosses a border. He received the baby in his arms with reverent terror, studied her for a long time, and the child, with the insolent wisdom of newborns, gripped one of his fingers and refused to return it. And then, finally, after 28 years, the most feared man in the city learned how to cry. Silently, without shame, with his Audrey's granddaughter holding his finger and the morning light entering through the window. "She will laugh the same way," he said in a ruined voice. "She is not laughing at anything yet, I know. But she will laugh the same way, I know it." Afterward, life did what life does. It continued. The shop in the arcade reopened 3 months later under another name, Audrey House, selling good furniture at prices ordinary people could afford, with every single employee from the old store inside. The younger saleswoman who had offered the glass of water now managed the showroom. The dismissed cook ran the cafe on the corner, and salaries were paid on the first business day of every month in envelopes prepared, naturally, by the owner herself. Rebecca Caldwell moved far away to the country house she managed to save from foreclosure, taking her pearls and her last name, and those who have seen her say she serves tea in fine china to no one. Brandon pays his support on the exact day, and once a month, still without permission to go upstairs, he leaves a toy for the little girl in the lobby. Frank records every one of them in the register, because Frank records everything, and someday that list will say whether the door opens or remains closed. Emily works at the foundation Julia opened with the first rent payment from the arcade, helping women left on the street with a suitcase and a pregnancy. No one gave her the position. She asked for it, started at the bottom, and never missed a day. And one sunny afternoon, in the garden of the house on the hill, with Audrey napping on her great-grandfather's chest and the chessboard waiting for the next move, Julia watched from the doorway and understood, with the calm that never left her again, the only truth worth the entire storm. Home was never a last name, a building, or a hall with crystal chandeliers. Home is whoever opens the door for you in the rain. Everything else is an address. Thank you for staying with this story until the end. If Julia's journey touched your heart, that like button helps these stories reach more people who need to remember today that dignity always finds its night. Subscribe so you do not miss the next one. And now tell me, because I want to read your answer, would you have forgiven Brandon, even if only for his daughter's sake? Or are there doors that should remain closed forever? And from what country are you joining us tonight? I will read you in the comments. And do not go far. The next story is already waiting, because there is a waitress who was fired over a stained dress, without anyone knowing what her signature could cancel.